With constantly new element characters coming out that are really good, and newer characters entering the top 5 list of Genshin Impact, people are now wondering if Pyro is getting a downfall, and if Pyro is becoming, out of meta now. Now, a little disclaimer before I make this video, I'm not saying that Pyro is the worst element, because we all know that goes to Geo, unfortunately. But I mean, is Pyro as a whole falling behind with characters, meta, reactions? Is that all falling behind? This is considering all its new reactions like Burgeon and Burning being really weak, and the reactions like Hyperbloom kind of being better than Vape. And answering to see if that question is actually true, or is it false? So let's see, is Pyro meta truly over? And for a quick analysis, let's look at what characters are considered really good, and let's see which one of them are Pyro. For a Pyro DPS, there are not really any good options other than Hu Tao, and she's pretty much dragging the Pyro weight on her shoulder right now, along with 4-star Zhangling, considering the fact that they're both really good. But also the best support in the game is a Pyro, which is Bennett, of course. I could also say Yoimiya, but Yoimiya is just a slightly worse version of Hu Tao, so there's really no point putting her up there. And all you D-Luke stands are gonna say, oh, why is D-Luke not up there? Because he's not. Grow the fuck up. So obviously, before we move on, I just want to let you know I do stream on Twitch, so please if you enjoyed this video, please go in the description and check me out. Right now I'm on my 2-week break, which means I can record and stream a lot more than I'd previously be able to, so please check me out if you can. Trust me, I'm worth the shot. Obviously, anyone with a brain would know that Dendro really brought out Electro characters and Hydro characters, but kind of threw shade at Pyro characters, considering the fact that Burgeon is a reaction which damages both yourself and the enemy combatant, and Burning is just Burning, and you're only going to use Burning with a melt team like Ayaka, so that really limits your choices there, because Burning on its own won't do any damage, and typically you're not going to be running Hu Tao and Ayaka on the same team, so Burning is pretty much useless in terms of the advantage for Pyro. Obviously, some of the best units in the whole game are Pyros, but does that really mean that Pyro overall as an element is really good? Because a strong character can carry an element, but it can only carry it so far. It can't just be called the best element because it's got a character in it. For example, Cryo is probably one of the worst elements, but we have characters like Ayaka, which is considered an S tier DPS because she's that amazing, but she's Cryo. So you really have to consider the balance there. Now, in my opinion, Vaporize is a really fun and sometimes even a really powerful reaction, especially on characters who rely on it like Hu Tao, D-Luke, and just pretty much any good Pyro DPS. But then in the other argument, you have Hyperbloom. Hyperbloom uses 3 elements, meaning that most likely you're more likely to be able to kill an enemy using Hyperbloom than Vape, which uses Pyro as the predominant. In my opinion, the bare Pyro units are Zhangling and Bennett, both which are amazing on the Vape teams of characters like, Nuvilette, Ayato, and Child, all really good characters paired with them, but the argument still stands. Now, also, a lot of enemies in the game, from what I've noticed, have a resistance to Pyro in any way of capacity, and Hyperbloom and Dendro seem to have more enemies which can actually withstand the element, obviously because Dendro is newer, so that means that obviously more enemies are susceptible to it. Now, you really gotta start talking about flexibility when it comes to these characters. With almost every single Pyro unit, you want to build crit and attack, and you really want to put a lot of time and effort into these builds. But with characters like Dendros, Electros, and Hydros, if you're building them in the Hyperbloom team, you can genuinely just get away with stacking EM on them, which for many is like a way of not being able to calculate how good an element is based on how long it takes to build it, but it is something you have to take in consideration, at least here or in any capacity. But once again, it's not something that's as hard to build as defense, because you're never really ever gonna have a defense piece if it's not just a throwaway at some Geo character. You're not gonna have it because no character in the game doesn't scale of defense that isn't Geo. So those artifacts in your inventory are going to be very few and far between. Now, Yoimiya and especially Hu Tao can be really strong DPSs if they're built correctly and they're played correctly. And with no denial, with that team, you can probably clear, with those characters, you can probably clear any abyss that you'd really like if you have the right team. I'm not saying that they're bad units, but by all means, Hyperbloom is also very much easier to achieve than having a Vape team, because with a Vape team, a lot of the time, especially if you're building a Hydro unit, you're going to want to have both Zhangling and Bennett just maxed out. And while Zhangling is a free character, Bennett really isn't. And on banners these days, he's very few and far between for obvious reasons. But genuinely, you can have a working Hyperbloom team almost really early game into Genshin. You can have Hyperbloom just there for you, ready to go. But aside from Hu Tao and Yoimiya, no 5-star Pyro unit will really give you any good damage. Obviously now we have Linny now in the game as well, but Linny is really strong, but he's only really strong when he can actually work And when you're dealing with enemies with shields, with enemies with resistance to pyro, there is nothing you can do in that situation, as you are limited to that one element, and Lily cannot really do that much in the wrong space. Now obviously my argument here is being that just because there are two good units of an element does not mean the element is good. For example, on Hydro, you have Ayato, Child, Nuvilette, so much more units, so much 5-star units that are actually really good for the game. Same with Dendro, you have Nahida, Tainari, Alhaitham, 3 really good units. Now obviously there are worse elements than Pyro. I'm not saying what they are now because I'm not trying to cause an argument on my comment section. You also have to consider that Vaporize provides players with a 1.5 times buff if they're a Pyro unit casting it on a Hydro unit, and it's 2x when it's the other way around. So the reaction is ultimately stronger for a Hydro unit than a Pyro unit. You also obviously have the Melt reaction, but there right now isn't a unit that is that good of producing Cryo and giving like Cryo application to the point where it's like there is no point using Melt, since there is no unit that provides such consistent damage. Even though it is 2x, there is no character that can provide that sort of utility the same way Yelan and other characters can. This limits Pyro to this one reaction of Vape, which isn't even its strongest. But what I can compliment Pyro for is that having Pyro and Hydro in a team is really good for clearing out like enemies, because if an enemy's got like a really high Pyro resistance, there's a big chance it's got really low Hydro resistance, and in that way they can kind of like backfire off each other when needed. Obviously before Dendro, Pyro was probably like the best element in the whole game by far. But Dendro now has put it like where the pedestal is nearly even, where Dendro is really good, but it's really bad for Pyro, and Pyro is really good and obviously bad for Dendro. So in conclusion of all this, I genuinely think that Pyro has actually fallen off just a little bit because there's more and more enemies that become resistant to it, and it's kind of in this place where Dendro is probably really better for it and easier to build, and it's just like more flexible and efficient in a lot of ways. And Pyro really has only 2 good DPS units and 2 really amazing sub DPS and support units. So to answer your question, is Pyro actually going to be viable in the future? Is Pyro viable now? Yes, of course it's viable now because the characters are really strong. But in the future, when they get power crept by stronger different element characters, Utah mains are cooked, I promise you. As always, thanks for listening to me up. If you like this video, please of course like it, comment, get my description, and check my Twitch. I can't speak English, I'm sleep deprived, it's 4 AM. Goodbye.